My name's Damian Day, and I'm Head of Education here at the GPhC, and I'm starting off this 1 hour long session. So I think what I'll start is where we want to end up, because I think that's perhaps the most helpful thing. And I think, as most of you will know, we have new for the initial education and training of pharmacists, and we're rolling them out across all of the schools of pharmacy and also across the 5th year of training. That's foundation. So there's quite a long journey that we need to go along, and that requires us as the regulator working with the schools, working with training providers. And so where we're heading is to have pharmacists who are much more clinical, and a number of years down the line, they'll also be independent prescribers. So that's quite a big change. And so we've been working our way through that systematically. So this is one, I suppose, of the earliest conversations with you. And I think we'll be able to answer some of your questions now, but probably not all of them. And so it might mean that you need to speak to schools of pharmacy down the line. Might mean you need to speak to us again. It might mean you need to speak to training providers. So we'll answer as many of the things that we can, but I think it's inevitable that we've had quite a lot of questions in advance, and we've looked at them. Some we can answer now, others I think we'll have to answer at a later date. So.
Thanks, Damian. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Fulton, and I'm the Director for Scotland here at the GPhC. My role tonight is really just to take you through some of the slides and give you some of the information and the context behind what we're trying to do. But before I do that, I want to hand over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi there, so I'm Sarah Purdy, and I'm one of the GPhC training facilitators. So I work quite closely with my colleague Lisa Gilbert, and we've got a role which is supporting the operation of the trainee pharmacists, and that's obviously involving some input into the work streams for implementation of foundation as well. So when I'm not working at the GPhC, I also hold a role as a practicing hospital pharmacy with an education and training background. So I'm a lead for a multi-sector post-registration programme. So again, it's put the context to help with the query answering perhaps today, because I will have similar questions to many of you out there wearing my other hat. So just to kind of put that into perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess that's the benefit of having Sarah and Lisa on the team. They both work with us here at the GPhC, but they've also got frontline roles, which keeps us grounded. I'm a pharmacist as well, so that does also give us a bit of context, albeit I don't practice as often as Sarah and Lisa do. So, welcome everybody. Before we go into some of the detail, I thought it'd be important to share with you some of the agenda, and then from there what we're going to discuss. So initially we will do a bit of an overview of the reforms to initial education and training for pharmacists, and you'll hear me start talking about IETP because it's a bit of a mouthful to keep saying initial education and training for pharmacists. We're going to give you a bit of an introduction and overview to the 2021 standards. But then we're going to look at what that means in relation to the MPharm degree, the Foundation Training Year, or FTY, the old pre-registration training year, what some training providers need to know. And we've also added a bit in relation to pharmacist independent prescribing, mainly focusing on what it means for those who are going through the degree and also what it means for the future, but a bit of a nod to those who are currently in the system working at the moment and where you can maybe get more information. And then it's very much a case of opening up to question time, answer some of the questions that we've either received already, so thank you for sending that in, or those that come in through the night. So let's see where we started. If we go back to March 2020, you'll all remember it well because it's when the COVID pandemic really took hold. Previous to that, we'd been doing some work at the GPhC to introduce new standards for IETP, and we were all excited and ready to go. That got put on hold as a result of all the work that was coming in to respond initially to the pandemic. And I've got to say, I think we're probably quite grateful that it did, because as the 6 months that went on through March to September 2020, we started to really see that there was a real role for pharmacists across the healthcare system that was going to be quite progressive and much more clinical. And as a result of that, there was a bit of an ask from our chief pharmaceutical officers, as well as some of our key stakeholders, to think about whether the standards were taking us far enough on a journey to be able to deliver what pharmacists were able to do in the future. So we introduced important changes to ensure that our pharmacists are equipped for their future roles. These standards will transform the education and training of pharmacists so they're much more equipped and able to play a greater role in providing clinical care for patients and the public. But I guess importantly, I would say at the bottom, changes are gradually being made to implement these reforms, but they're not taking years and years and years and years. So we have got an end goal of seeing some of these changes come into fruition of 2026. And I'll come back to the detail of what that means as we move forward. So what are the new standards? The new standards for me are really quite exciting, if I'm honest, because what they do is they define clearly what a pharmacist is. And previous to that, we've always had ideas and definitions about what a pharmacist does and what they get involved in, but this clearly sets out that pharmacists are indeed experts in medicines. It goes on to say that they're confident, competent and capable. They're dedicated to person-centred care, so that person is always at the centre in their decision-making and their professional judgment. They are delivering compassion and empathy and working with the patient to make sure that the choices that they make are right for them. And the big change, I think, that came in as a result of a lot of the work through the pandemic is that these pharmacists will become proficient prescribers. So prescribing is being weaved in to the first 5 years of initial education and training, instead of what currently happens, which is that tagging on of an independent prescribing qualification post-registration. So lots of big changes to come, lots of exciting things in the mix. But I think critically it's important to recognise that these are progressive standards, but we're not losing sight of the fact that we've got a great number of many pharmacists on the register at the moment whose skills, attributes and long service are really important and really valuable for what we need to do to take these guys through in a journey. So albeit it might feel like this is the shiny new pharmacist, a lot of what's going on in pharmacy at the moment is as a result of all the people who are working there just now, and we want to build on using them to help implement these new standards. There's some key changes in the standards from the last time that we did this. So 2011 was the last time we produced standards. And if you think back to what you were doing in 2011 and what we're doing now in 2022, there's probably quite a lot of changes going on. And that's why these the introduction of changes have taken place. So as I say, independent prescribing is a big fundamental change. It's really about incorporating the skills, the knowledge and the attributes for prescribing from day one in pharmacy school and being able to prescribe independently from the point of registration. Now, I know that's probably going to set the hairs running amongst many of you thinking, oh my goodness, they're going to come out on day one and they're going to have a prescription pad and be able to do prescribing and decide what the heck we want to do all the time. But the reality actually is we're just the vehicle enabling this. It'll be the service and the stakeholders and the NHS that will essentially decide where the prescribing element will fit. And we envisage that this being something that is very different across all 3 countries, but equally that ability to prescribe is there to be able to make it happen. Science and clinical practice. We've always had science in the pharmacy degrees. It's really important, as we all know, that everybody understands the basic science, that they understand the physiology, the pharmacology, the body and how it works. But what we now want to do is take that a stage further. That knowledge and underpinning information is necessary, but there's a much greater focus on key skills. We're introducing and including professional judgment, clinical decision making, management of risk and diagnostic and consultation skills, again all going hand in hand with the prescribing element of this course. The pre-registration training year, as we're all at the GPhC trying to remember it's no longer called, has been replaced with a foundation training year. And again, it's a similar makeup where the trainee pharmacist will spend their year out in practice, putting into practice what they've learned at university, what they've developed, and really enhancing and increasing the complexity of their skills. But what we have introduced is a strengthened clinical supervision and support, and much more collaboration between the universities, the statutory education bodies such as HEE, NES and HEIW, and the employers to make sure that overall the foundation training year is a build on the first 4 years of training. And lastly, equality, diversity and inclusion. It's always been there, but what we've done is put a greater emphasis on this in two particular areas. One, in relation to selection and admission, to make sure that the demographics and the look at the makeup of those who are joining the course is really considered and reflective of our population. But secondly, there's a much greater focus on teaching our students about equality, diversity and inclusion, and how they would address, for example, discrimination and health inequalities within their day-to-day working when they are practicing as pharmacists. So that focus is really shifted onto that area as well. A bit now on the domains and learning outcomes. So for those of you that are familiar with the old pre-registration standards and what we had to do, we had 76 performance standards that our trainee pharmacists had to essentially tick off through their 5th year to be able to demonstrate that they were suitable to sit the registration assessment and essentially join our register. Those 76 performance standards were very specific to that 5th year, and previous to that, in years 1 to 4, the universities had learning outcomes that the student pharmacists were expected to be able to demonstrate and were used to sign off the student pharmacists to be able to get their degree. What we've done with the new 2021 standards is we've amalgamated the learning outcomes for years 1 to 4 and the professional standards to create 55 learning outcomes that span years 1 to 5. And the reason for that is really to ensure we've got that continuation of practice, that what we're doing through years 1 to 4, using experiential learning, simulation and traditional lectures, is then carried on through into that 5th year, wherein most of the occasions you're expected to show a greater level of ability, more complexity and more exposure to patients. You'll see there that around the 55 LOs or learning outcomes, there's 4 domains, and these 4 domains are the key areas for which you will be learning and developing. Person-centred care and collaboration is domain 1, professional practice, leadership and management, and education and research. And it's also worth noting that these domains actually then map over to the domains that the RPS have in their post-registration areas of practice, so that we can essentially get a trainee starting in day 1 of pharmacy school using these domains, using this type of practice all the way through to when they retire. The other triangle on the page is Miller's triangle, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, Miller's triangle, there's more information in the standards, but basically this is the levels at which somebody at either university or in their foundation training year has to demonstrate their learning outcome. So knows how, shows how, and does obviously is at the point where you're able to demonstrate that with consistency and feel confident in what you're doing. And therefore these 55 learning outcomes are mapped to one of these 4 elements of the triangle. So again, it's just to give you the context behind what we're trying to do and get you to understand that these learning outcomes cover the 5 years. I guess the other thing for those of you who are on the call who are pharmacy students, I would really encourage you all to go and really have a look at these learning outcomes and think about how you in your current university are maybe seeing how these are mapped out in your course, or equally if you're in your fourth year and heading into your foundation training year, what they will then look like in that fifth year, so you know what you're trying to work towards and demonstrate. These learning outcomes should become something that are familiar to you from day one. And again, we would encourage employers to make sure that they're aware of the learning outcomes and that they're encouraging their trainees and their student pharmacists to be familiar with them. So again, that's a key area that we would want everybody to understand and look at, so we know what we're looking towards learning. So I guess this little diagram and picture is really just to put into context what it is that we're trying to do over the 5 years. And I'm very much a picture person, so that's why I like to be able to present this as well. So as you can see, in the main, we have 4 years as an MPharm degree, a 5th year foundation training year in purple. Below that is some blocks of experiential learning, and what you'll see there is that they're increasing as the years go on. And right across the top in the teal green is the independent prescribing, and it's very much about it being woven through the 5 years and not just a bolt on at the end. And I think that's important that we recognise that up to now we've always talked about prescribing being independent to undergraduate learning, that it's something you do after you join the register, but this is very much about the trainees and the student pharmacists understanding prescribing from day one and the skills and attributes that go with it. The learning outcomes, as you see across the bottom, span the 5 years, and it really is the initial education and training pathway. So it's just really to help visualise what it is we're trying to do. Now, obviously, we do have some integrated 5-year degrees, so where the foundation training year fits, and that purple bit varies for some of them, but in the main, the majority are working towards this kind of model. So just key changes in terminology, and I deliberately put this in here because, as I said at the very beginning, we at the GPhC are having to train ourselves to remember the new terminology and what's been said. So for everybody out there, the pre-registration training year is no more. We now need to talk about the foundation training year. Pre-registration trainees are in the past, and we now have trainee pharmacists. And I guess for the patients and public, as they are interacting with our trainee pharmacists, it does what it says in the tin. They are training to be pharmacists, and the pre-registration training bit gets dropped to make it slightly easier. Our tutors are now known as designated supervisors, and I guess the reason for that is that there has to be one person nominated for the trainee to be able to work alongside, but the expectation is that we will be utilising members of the team, other healthcare professionals to really help this designated supervisor determine whether the trainee is ready to sit the registration assessment and join our register. And as I said, for year 5, the learning outcomes have replaced the performance standards. So that's a key part that we need to remember. So if you don't take anything else away from tonight, and I'm sure you'll take lots away, is please start using the terminology and the new language, and that'll help everybody move in the right direction. On this slide here, it's just simply up there to let you see that we are working in partnership with many different organisations and groups. And the reason for this is that we have in the standards set what it is we are setting out to do, why we want to do it, but the fundamental how of how it all comes together can only really happen if everybody works together to deliver that. And it's, I guess, the service and the NHS, the universities, the statutory education bodies who really have the ability now to go away and translate these standards into something that is meaningful and tangible. And I guess that's where we're at just now. We're all working through translating the standards and making them a bit clearer as to how they will then come into fruition. So what will the MPharm degree look like in this new world? Again, we've not ripped everything up and started entirely from the beginning. A lot of what was in the 2011 standards has translated into the 2021 standards. But what we are looking for is that student pharmacists' skills, knowledge, understanding, and professional behaviours will progress. They'll be expected to demonstrate the learning outcomes to a greater depth, breadth, and degree of complexity. and there's much greater emphasis on experiential and interprofessional learning. So again, we're looking for a much more quality experiential learning opportunity and the opportunity to interact with other healthcare professionals. From 2021-22 onwards, so the year that's just started in September last year, Year 1 students will all have been transferred from the 2011 standards to the new standards throughout their degree and will complete the programme after that. For years 2 to 4 and the OSPAP students, a teach out process will be managed and they will complete the programme to the 2011 standards. So Year 1, 2021 standards, years 2 to 4 will be working towards the 2011 standards, but there'll be an introduction throughout those years of the new elements of the learning outcomes, so that as we move towards the vision of prescribing, that'll be more obvious for those available. And future cohorts from 2021 onwards will all be taught to these new standards in their entirety. In relation to the foundation training year, or the FTY year, as I said earlier, strengthens educational supervision, greater collaborative working between higher education institutes, statutory education bodies and employers, further exposure for trainee pharmacists to new situations and environments, and the opportunity to build upon their knowledge and skills and demonstrate these within with patients in a clinical setting. So really taking that foundation of university and building on it with patients and the public in that FTY year. And again, for 2021-22 onwards, the current cohort and those in years 2 to 4 or who are through the OSPAP course at university have to demonstrate interim learning outcomes. So what we've done, because we realise that we can't introduce these standards straight off within 1 year and go with them, we've introduced interim learning outcomes, which are available on our website for you to see, but what they exclude is the prescribing element, and it will not result in an IP annotation at the point of registration. Year 1 students and future cohorts will need to demonstrate the 2021 learning outcomes in their fullness throughout their foundation training year, which does include prescribing and will result in the IP annotation at the point of registration. So if you start university in Year 1, 2021, then you will, in 2026, be at the point that you will have that IP annotation at the point of registration. I've got some information here on each of the FTY years in each of the countries, and it's really just there to say if you're in England or Scotland or Wales, this is the process. So I won't go into full detail, but as you can see on here, England, HEE is introducing a single system-wide commissioning model for trainee foundation pharmacist education in England. It'll cover all training places and all trainees in England across all sectors, supported by NHS funding and crucially including community pharmacy. And again, that collaboration piece with key stakeholders to determine the processes is what's currently happening. So exciting times in England and a shift to moving for equity for all trainees. In Scotland and Wales, they will continue with what they do at the moment, which is to manage their 5th year of education and training. NES in Scotland will continue to do that as they've done previously. And Wales have introduced a multi-sector placement for all from August this year. So they are very much focusing on managing the 5th year, but it will be through multi-sector placements from this year onwards. So again, that relationship between NES, HIW in Wales, as well as HE in England and ourselves and the other partners will be crucial to make sure this delivers what we need it to do. For those that need to apply for an FTY, the applying window opened at 12 p.m. on the 8th of June and will close on the 12th at 12 o'clock on the 22nd of June. So that window's still open. I'm sure you're all busy working on that, but again, for any employers out there or those who are on that maybe have trainees or student pharmacists that are at this stage, make those dates be recognised and available. Recruitment will then take place in September, October time. for trainees beginning their foundation training in summer 2023. An application for all is via the Oreo platform, which I'm sure those of you who are on the call in this situation are familiar with or have been through and can give some information if necessary. Remember as well that you also have to apply to the GPhC by setting up a My GPhC account before you start your foundation training, so that your application to start can be assessed and confirmed and it meets the scheme requirements before you're able to start. So don't forget about us, and again, any information you need on that will be available on our website. And again, for training providers, I guess it's important that we lay out what you need to know. As I said, in England, you as training providers need to submit your training plan to the GPhC, mapped to the interim learning outcomes for 2022-23. For Scotland and Wales, again, the training plans are provided by NEST and HEIW respectively, but they too are mapped to the interim learning outcomes. I guess now it's probably important that we come on to a bit around pharmacist independent prescribing before we finish up and move to questions. And I guess a lot of you will want to know a lot more detail about pharmacist independent prescribing and where it all fits. As I said earlier, those who started the MPharm from last September, so September 2021 onwards, and who join the register from 2026 onwards will be annotated as independent prescribers. Those who started their MPharm before 2021-22 will still have to undertake IP training once they have joined the register. And current pharmacists are all eligible to undertake IP training at any point once they've registered. Requirements for entry onto an independent prescribing course. I hope a lot of you know that very recently we had a consultation out to look at exactly that, the requirements for entry onto an independent prescribing course. Previously, we had an expectation that everybody had to be on the register for a minimum of 2 years as one of the criteria to be considered to join an independent prescribing course. Our council very recently have agreed to drop that 2-year rule, and now it's a case of looking for relevant experience in a pharmacy setting, being able to recognise, understand and articulate skills and attributes required to be a prescriber, and to crucially still identify an area of clinical or therapeutic practice which will be the base for learning. And I think it's important there to point out it's the base for learning. So once you're qualified as a prescriber, you may then go on and choose another area to specialise in or another area to develop, but that very much will then be down to you as an individual to decide whether you're able to do that or competent, whether you need training or more development, and what your scope of practice is. But we've maintained the area of clinical or therapeutic practice so that we can make sure that people are learning within a narrow area to really develop the skills. There are training opportunities for registered pharmacists who are currently on the register, and I know a lot of you are really keen to understand what's happening for those that we know as the legacy workforce. In England, Scotland and Wales, you'll see here that there are now opportunities for fully funded training in all 3 countries, and you'll notice that there are places being made available imminently across all of them. So I would encourage all of you who are currently pharmacists on the register, however many years you're qualified, and who now think they want to get involved with prescribing, to interact with HEE, NEST or HEIW. And in actual fact, HEE are hosting a webinar coming up soon, for which we'll share some of the details with you, and they'll be able to answer a lot more of the questions that are out there in relation to this. For newly qualified pharmacists, so those pharmacists who kind of are going to be brand new qualified or who are in years 2 to 4 at university just now and just miss out, because that's probably how it feels for all of you. Again, all 3 countries and all 3 statutory education bodies have developed a newly qualified pharmacist pathway foundation training programme to encourage you to join that in the first couple of years of registration. And during that, you will be exposed to your IP training as well. So really what the plan is here is not to take more of a gap for you who are just recently qualified or are about to qualify, And very quickly through the first 2 years will be developed so that you too can have your independent prescribing qualification as well. So that's the opportunities available. And again, that's for both newly qualified, those who are just about to be qualified but miss out, and also for our pharmacy workforce who have maybe been on the register for many years and not had the opportunity. So speak to any of these providers and they can give you more information, as we can signpost as well. So really that brings me to the end of all the information. I realise that was a gallop through a lot of information at pace, and probably my Scottish accent means it's even quicker than normal, so I hope you kept up with me. The opportunity now is really to open to questions, and we've got Damian here, we've got Sarah, and we've got myself, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can, but equally if there's things that do come up that we can't answer tonight, we'll try and signpost you in the future as to where we are and what's going on. But I think it's important to say that Damian was right when he opened this with, it's a journey, it's the start of a journey. There's lots of questions that remain unanswered, but from my perspective, and I think those at the GPhC, it's an exciting time looking forward to what essentially will be real difference of pharmacists in clinical practice in NHS across Scotland, England and Wales and wider. So thank you very much for your time, and over to you, Susanna, for this part.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name's Susanna, and I work in the communications team at the GPhC. I have been looking through the questions that we've received, either when people signed up to the webinar and also through the Q&A box whilst Laura and the others have been talking. Basically, what I've done here is kind of amalgamated some of these together around topics. Obviously, we had lots and lots of sign-ups. We've got quite a few people here today, and we've got quite a busy Q&A box. So we're probably not going to get through absolutely everything, but hopefully, if I can group these around particular topics, we can have a bit of a chat, and I can pose the questions to the various panel members, and we can get some information out, which is really helpful, kind of for everybody. This particular point, knowing that there's going to be more information and more stuff, coming along as we develop this. So I think we've talked a little bit about trainees, about students, and we'll come back to that. There's lots of questions about what people need to do at that particular stage, but obviously there's looking at the polls earlier on, there's lots of people on the call who are currently pharmacists, who are out there, who are practicing and maybe looking to run training as well. And we got a lot of questions in about how do I get this? Do I absolutely need to do this? And finding designated prescribing practitioners. So I just wanted to, I guess, go to maybe Sarah and Damian about what, there are some pharmacists out there who said, one of the questions we had was, I'm looking to retire in around 10 years time. Can I still continue if I'm not headed towards doing IP? Damian, I don't know whether you want
to... Yes, is the answer. So if you want to train as an IP, great. If you don't want to, because you are happy with the way that you're working at the moment, that's also absolutely fine. So there won't be a moment at which you aren't allowed to be on the register because you aren't an IP. And so in terms of finding a training place, I think it's really a question of looking at the training courses in your area and probably speaking to the course providers. I think that's probably the best way forward. In terms of finding a DPP, that's a little bit trickier in the sense that you might actually have somebody in your network, and they might be a pharmacist, they might be a nurse, they might be a doctor who can help you out as a DPP. If not, ask around in your local networks more widely, and you might actually find somebody that way. And also ask the IP course providers as well, because they have networks as well.
Brilliant. Okay.
From Damian's point there's something about the infrastructure that you've got within your organisation and that succession planning, because as we know that it's a DPP, not a DMP, that has to support the IP training. So, sorry, speaking in acronyms, but what I'm saying here is that it could be that you've got an experienced pharmacist that's a prescriber that could take that role on as from now, actually. But so it is a case of perhaps looking at your current workforce, your strategy, what the local needs are in terms of prescribing scope as well. So it's not just a case of just doing the independent prescribing for the sake of having that kind of annotation. There is about how you're going to use it for your patient population. So we have to always keep the patients in mind here as well, that part of the purpose of this reform and change is actually to improve of care and making sure that the whole system is much more joined up, and that is, you know, the direction that we're traveling. So it all links with that kind of forward planning and infrastructure that you're building and putting in place, getting your current skill set within your workforce to be able to support these trainees coming through the system and through the pipeline going forward.
Great, thank you. Also, I think this might be one for you, Sarah. There's a couple of newly qualified pharmacists who submitted questions around doing clinical diplomas. There was one person who said, should I still try and do a clinical diploma before applying to be a prescriber? And there was somebody else who is actually currently in their second year, or sorry, in their first year of a postgraduate diploma, and they were asking whether they should essentially ditch that and try and get on an IP course amongst clinical diplomas. And then there's also other people on care pathways and different things like that. So how does it fit with that kind of training situations?
Yeah, and I think, you know, these are very individualized questions. Should you or shouldn't you? It's very much individual depending on your career pathway. But I don't think it's an either or question. It's about how these two things dovetail together. So if you're going to be an independent prescriber in a specific scope of practice, there is something about making sure you've got that really robust clinical knowledge behind you to be able to practice safely and effectively in that area. So if the way to get that robust and experience and everything is through a clinical diploma, that is potentially what you would want to do. But there's many ways to do these, and of course if you've come through the new degree over the next few years, then there will be a shift in how the emphasis is delivered in those undergraduate courses to prepare you for roles. So I think that the question is, it depends on you as an individual whether that's the right pathway for you. We certainly wouldn't be saying today absolutely everyone just stop what you're doing and move to IP. It's a dovetail. It's all part of, I mean, you've just mentioned the newly qualified foundation pathway, and actually IP is part of that, but that clinical knowledge is still really important as well. So, you know, you learn what you learn in the M-Pharm, but there is that ongoing development forever, really, as a pharmacist, that you always build on that. There's always something new to learn. So just to sort of keep going, really.
Excellent, thank you. Laura, if I could come to you as well. There was a couple of questions here around how we're going to help ensure that pharmacists are confident enough in themselves as professional decision makers, and how we're going to empower them to be filling these kind of roles where they need to perform this kind of independent prescribing.
Thanks, Susanna. It's a dead interesting question, because I think, being a pharmacist myself, I know often we are risk averse, and we always default to what's legal and make a decision based on that. So a lot of what we need to do is change the culture at that undergraduate level, so that absolutely what's legal is important, but there's that element of professional judgment. And we're working in partnership with the RPS and those post-registration providers to really think about what the future might look like to help change that culture. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that element, but that whole professional judgment, accountability, linked to our own GPhC professional standards, needs to be much more of a focus, so that those who are helping train these new young pharmacists coming through are confident and competent as well. So it's a journey for all of us, including me.
Great, that's good to know. I think it sounds like we're out here. Also, I don't know whether this is something you could talk about as well, as in the Q&A box we had a question about how we're going to continue to kind of how we would continue to assess somebody's suitability to prescribe. You know, it might be something that you learn about, and then if you're not in a role where you're actually doing that, but you're obviously, you know, still on the register and still able to, how do we actually how are we going to look, maybe in terms of revalidation or other tools, but how are we going to know how somebody's, you know, maintaining competence?
Thanks, Susanna. And again, this is a really interesting part in our world, GPhC at the moment. We're just about to kick off a post-registration assurance of practice group, and that's very much looking at what the future will look like post-registration. They acknowledge that there's big changes in the world of pharmacy, that clinical focus, that prescribing focus, that new emerging sectors are all coming through. And we have a group who are due to meet next week for the first time, who will be looking at how we, as the GPhC, get that assurance. And it could be something like enhanced revalidation. It could be that there's more requirement for certain roles to do some of the RPS credentialing. But fundamentally, at this point in time, we do not know. So the first big piece of work is a horizon scanning exercise to understand the priorities and what that may look like. And it's very much everything is open for looking at, and let's see what the future brings. So it goes very nicely hand in hand with the reform to initial education and training to then think about post-registration. How do we give patients and the public that assurance?
Great, thank you. I don't know, Damian, if you wanted to come in on that one as well. And there's also a question here from, I guess, an older pharmacist. Will older pharmacists be supported in the transition to independent prescribing? They talk about maybe supplementary prescribing as a first. Are there any kind of steps, or how do we deal with that?
So I suppose to answer the first question, it's all about scope of practice, and so that links with CPD, it links with revalidation, and so you might want to sort of upskill yourself, and then make a note of that in CPD and in revalidation. In terms of, is there any particular support for older pharmacists? Not specifically, but on the other hand, speak to your employer, speak to colleagues there that can help you. But I mean, it's not really an ageist thing, you know. If you're late in your career to upskill as an IP, great. But as I say, you might need to find a skilled.
Excellent, great. But yeah, going back to what you said before about, you know, there isn't a mad need to do this absolutely straight away, and there's going to be, you know, the opportunity. If it doesn't sound like it's for you, then there, you know, you can continue as you are. Right. Okay.
Susanna, just building on that before, I think that's a really important point. You know, that, and I noticed there's some questions in the chat about the traditional pharmacist roles, and I'm not saying that the traditional pharmacist roles of dispensing and processing and procurement are not important. What we're recognising though is that as health pharmacists do have such a unique expert in medicine skill that we need to further enhance and utilise, and there will always be place for pharmacists to do roles, but the driver needs to be into this clinical focus, and that's going to be over the next 20, 30 years. I'm sure I'm going to be retired before it fully reforms to the ultimate end goal. Therefore, we will need pharmacists who are currently working to maintain that expertise. And I guess the one thing that I would say is 5 years at university and a 5th year of training doesn't necessarily give you that lifelong experience and understanding and where something's gone wrong and you've learned from it. Therefore, we need that knowledge and experience in the system to help these newly qualified and new trainees through as well. So there's a role for everybody here.
Excellent. Me on to the next question I was going to ask, which was submitted before the webinar, which is, what can we, or what do we as registrants need to do and over the next few months, years, to support this work? I don't know, Sarah, that's probably something you might know a little bit about in your practical role.
Well, I think I've already touched on that really, about, you know, starting to think about that infrastructure. So, you know, we know that there's going to be this cohort coming through into foundation in 2020, to think about how you're going to support and develop those people, what you might actually want to use those 2026 registrants to support with their prescribing role, because you know, the aspect that perhaps you know, they will want to sort of focus on and specialize. And I think that some of that work will be driven potentially at statutory education body level. So I know that, they've certainly in Scotland, they've been looking at some of the schemes that they've got running and how that will dovetail into, and we hear the words sort of generalist prescribing, but actually when we say that, we don't mean being able to prescribe absolutely anything. We talk about perhaps those things like minor ailment schemes that we've got in place at the moment. We might currently be running certain things under PGDs, and that might be the sort of starting point, for people with those prescribing skills there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think that's given a good grounding for if you're currently practicing. Let's move on to foundation trainees and OSPAP students and MPharm students. There's a question here, Damian, I think this might be helpful, this might be good for you, around how will a specific area of clinical practice be chosen for independent prescribing for a trainee pharmacist, or and will foundation pharmacists complete a general scope NMP qualification, or is it scope specialism training later? I think we sort of touched on it.
Yeah, so in terms of prescribing in the 5th year, that will to a large extent depend on the SEBs and what they actually want. And then also there'll be a conversation there between the trainee pharmacist and their trainer. So it might vary between individuals. I think where we are at the moment is that it's probably likely to be more general at the start. You might actually find an area of particular interest and move into that. But I think the main thing is, you won't be doing everything immediately. So yes, you'll spend the 4 years at university, you'll spend the 5th year in training, and then you'll ease yourself into other areas of IP as you mature.
Great, okay. And another sort of general question here from a couple of questions that we've received, but basically, if you're going through the system now, so if you, if you're 2nd, 3rd, 4th year now, so you're not going to end up as an IP automatically at the point of registration. And maybe if you're, if you are later on and there are situations where, you need to pause training, or you need to, spend some time outside of university for whatever reason, what happens to people in that situation where they might not be headed towards, IP at the point of registration? Is there a sort of transition period? And
I suppose Laura explained that on her slide. So it basically, if you need to train as an IP once you're on the register, then you need to have relevant experience. So I guess you need to check that that's the case, and I think it will be helpful if you spoke to an actual prescriber. It would be helpful if you spoke to your employer and then work towards that. So when you then made an application, you were reasonably sure that you were actually ready.
Okay, so basically there is provision if for some reason your training takes longer or your study takes longer than you expected. It doesn't mean that that's it. You can't do it again.
That's it. Yeah.
Sarah, Susanna, the relevant experience, and I noticed there's some questions about this in the chat around whether your foundation training year would count or not. Again, it's individual as to the trainee and the provider, but ultimately there is lots of experiences that will be useful in your foundation training year that can be used as examples of experience in a relevant. So we're not saying that all of it is suitable, we're not saying that none of it is, and it will very much depend on the individual. So again, that's something to consider moving forward as well.
Great, thank you. And also I wondered about, so we talked a little bit about OSPAP students, and I know that that's part of the ongoing work in terms of looking at how qualifications and how they work. Wondered, and also for international students, there was a question around, does this impact international students studying MPharm in the UK, or is it the same for everybody? Sarah or Damian, I don't know whether that's one for either of you, or
just start with the international students. So if they're on the MPharm course, they are following the same pathway as any home graduate. So there shouldn't be any change in that. In terms of the OSPAP, I'm going to deflect to Damian just because he's probably in a better position to update where we.
Yes. So where we are is that we are working our way through the current OSPAP course. We're thinking about the implications of Brexit. So over the next year, I think we'll be working it through. So it could be the case that in the end, we end up with IP in the OSPAP, or it may not be the case. So I think the honest answer is for the next 6 months, this space.
Excellent. Thanks very much. It is 2 minutes to 8, so I am going to wrap up at this particular point. I hope that we've covered at least some of the things that people have been asking. And it sounds like, as people said earlier on, that there's lots still to work out, and it's just a case of, talking in and amongst your networks and finding out a little bit more about what you need to do in your local area, basically. I'm going to hand over to Damian now to finish up, and thanks very much for your questions.
Thank you. So, I suppose what you've heard and what you've seen is that the 2021 standards mean quite a big change for pharmacy, and I think it's a question of realizing the potential of where you might end up as a pharmacist, but also holding your nerve. I think there'll be things that you don't know at the moment which you want to know, because that's the nature of any change. But what we can say is that we will be as communicative as we can over the years, but it might take a year, it might take 18 months before you have all the answers that you want. So I think really thank you for asking your questions, and stick with us.